Hi everyone, so today we're going to start talking about effective survey design. So as you know, there's two kinds of questions that you can ask participants on a survey: open-ended questions and closed-ended questions. So some things to consider for both types of questions are that you should really avoid using any kind of jargon or acronyms or any kind of abbreviations that people might not be familiar with. So keeping it really simple to make sure that people will really be able to understand what you're asking them is in your best interest, so the data that you're getting is actually meaningful. Second, you should also avoid double-barreled questions, meaning questions that actually ask two separate things at the same time. So for instance, you might say something like, please agree or disagree with the following statements. How satisfied are you with your pay and job conditions? It's quite possible that you may be satisfied with your pay but not your job conditions, or vice versa. So you should either remove the less important part of the question or formulate two separate questions to get this answered. Third, you should also avoid any kind of loaded or leading questions. We've already talked about social desirability. If you give people the sense that they should respond in a certain way, right, their responses are not going to be truthful. So that's something you want to avoid. So for instance, an example of a leading question would be, have you stopped beating your wife? Clearly, right, there's this insinuation that that's not socially acceptable, and have you stopped yet would basically lead everyone to saying yes, of course, right? You would never get a negative response here. Fourth, you should also try to avoid negative wording simply because it makes things more complicated, and sometimes leads to false responses because people didn't understand the question correctly. You've probably noticed that on exams, right? Any of the exam questions, multiple choice items that say which one is not included, right? They're a little bit more difficult because sometimes they get confusing. So anything you can do to avoid negative phrasing is in your best interest because you're going to get the most accurate data. So for instance, do you feel that UNE should not build a new dormitory? Right? You have to be in agreement. To be in agreement with the statement, you have to disagree with the proposal. And then last but not least, to avoid people adopting a response set, you should include some questions that are reverse coded. So sometimes people have to agree or disagree to actually express their opinion on something. So let's go over a couple of examples. Here we have one survey question that says, when was the last time you upgraded your computer and printer? So you guessed correctly, this is an example of a double-barreled question, right? If you're asking this question, how will you know which one they actually upgraded? It could be one of them, it could be both of them, but you'll never really know with this question. So to improve the item, you would try to eliminate the less important topic or create two separate questions. Our next example would be, do you approve of the president's oppressive immigration policy? This, of course, is an example of a leading or loaded question. So you should always avoid including emotive words such as oppressive, right? It has a negative connotation. Therefore, people will right away pick up on the fact that it's not socially acceptable, right? You're asking more about, do you actually think it's socially acceptable to be oppressive? Not so much asking about the immigration policy. So as a researcher, you should remove your personal opinion from the survey and not include it. So to make this item better, you could say, do you approve of the president's immigration policy? Next, so if you ask people about their current age, right, this is an example of a question that's actually not exhaustive. So, what if a person is actually less than 10 years old or over 40, right? They wouldn't have a box to tick here. So to make this better, always make sure that you're including all possible options. And sometimes it's hard to think of everything. So it's always nice to maybe have somebody else go through your questions and talk aloud as they're going through them to make sure you're accounted for all possibilities. Okay, lastly, should the policy chief not be directly responsible to the mayor? Would be an example of negative wording, of course. The negative wording here makes the question somewhat ambiguous and difficult to understand. So again, you're less likely to get an accurate response from people because some people might misunderstand and then answer the question incorrectly. So it's better to ask something like, do you think the policy chief should be directly responsible to the mayor? Another example would be, do you own a tablet PC? Right, some people might not exactly know what a tablet PC is, right? So giving them maybe some possibilities might be a little bit more effective. So this is an example of jargon use. So you should always avoid using jargon, any abbreviations or acronyms whenever possible. You know, the person might not know what a tablet PC is, or they might have an idea, but they might not know what will be included in that. So this survey question could be fixed by giving some examples, so people would then be able to answer the question a little bit better. And then last but not least, the last thing to try to avoid is a response set. So people actually have the tendency sometimes to respond to answers in the same way that they answered other questions. So right, once they get tired later on in the survey, they just kind of keep checking the same box because they think that all questions, kind of ask the same questions. So to avoid that, you should have some reverse coded items. So for instance, you could take some of your items on the survey and just reverse them. So you could take an item that, for instance, says, I always look forward to going to work, and rewrite it to say, I always dread going to work. So a respondent who actually enjoys their job would have to agree with the first statement, but they would have to disagree with the wording of the second statement to break that response set. If you're noticing that they're answering the question the same, you know that they didn't take it seriously, and it's a good idea to remove their data. All right, this is it for today.